There was a farmer whose horse ran away. That evening, the neighbors gathered to commiserate with him, since this was such bad luck. He said, "Maybe." The next day, the horse returned, but brought with it 6 wild horses, and the neighbors came exclaiming at his good fortune. He said, "Maybe." And then the following day, his son tried to saddle and ride one of the wild horses, was thrown, and broke his leg. Again, the neighbors came to offer their sympathy for the misfortune. He said, "Maybe." The day after that, conscription officers came to the village to seize young men for the army. But because of the broken leg, the farmer's son was rejected. When the neighbors came in to say how fortunately everything had turned out, he said maybe. 0 to ground zero. The Mitsubishi A6M Reisen, commonly known as the Zero, is interwoven through the history of Japan during World War II. A symbol of Japanese power during the war, it played a pivotal role in the events that led to the rise and fall of an empire. It helped Japan triumph, but also aided in bringing about tragedies that are remembered to this day. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria and effectively ruled it by creating a puppet state called Manchukuo. By 1933, they left the League of Nations and started an undeclared war with China. This became known as the Second Sino-Japanese War, officially declared in 1937. As time went on, they eventually occupied Korea, parts of Mongolia, and China. Further eastward expansion was fueled by the concept of ridding Asian colonies from Western imperialism and the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, in addition to a need to acquire resources. In 1937, the Japanese Navy sent a request for 2 Japanese companies, Mitsubishi and Nakajima, to design a modern escort fighter to compete with more advanced industrial countries. However, upon viewing the design requirements, neither company was inclined to continue with the bid. At the time, Japanese aviation was far behind other countries, such as Germany and the US, and the project seemed too ambitious. Jiro Horikoshi, the chief designer for the Mitsubishi's A5M Type 96 fighter, argued that it would be possible to create a plane meeting the Navy's requirements. His argument swayed his superiors, and Mitsubishi alone continued on with the project. The Navy required that the plane be maneuverable and have a superior performance over its opponents, and needed the plane's maximum speed at more than 500 kilometers per hour at 4,000 meters altitude. This was faster than the A5M's 440 kilometers per hour. In addition to this increase in speed, they also required an increase in range over that of the world's best modern fighters. On top of all this, Japan was severely restricted in terms of material sources, so they would have to conserve what little they had. Horikoshi's main concern was weight. If the plane was too heavy, they would need a large engine, which would use up precious fuel and limit range. He partially solved the weight problem by making use of a new alloy called Extra Super Duralumin, or ESD, which was harder and lighter than pure aluminum, by making use of flush rivets, which also improved aerodynamics, and by drilling holes in the frame of the aircraft. This wasn't enough, however, and in the end they had to make trade-offs that sacrificed safety in order to sufficiently reduce weight. The thicker plate armoring normally included in other planes to protect the engine, fuel tank, and cockpit was cut from the Zero's design, along with the self-sealing fuel tanks. The end result was extremely light and fast, but not as durable as conventional fighter planes. After 3 years of development, the Zero finally saw action in 1940. In its first year of operation in China, the new fighter downed 44 Chinese aircraft with the loss of only 2 Zeros, leading the Navy to believe that they could handle a 1 to 2 to 5 ratio of Zeros to enemy fighters. This was a personal victory for Jiro, as it proved his design was well made, giving Japan an advantage in military strength. In July of 1941, Franklin D. Roosevelt placed a trade embargo on Japan to aid China in the Sino-Japanese War. The embargo limited Japan's access to resources. Because of the lack of natural resources on the Japanese archipelago, they depended on oil and iron imports for ongoing productions of munitions. Roosevelt saw the embargo as a way to restrain Japan and ensure they wouldn't do anything extreme against the U.S. agenda. However, this only further encouraged Japan to take French Indochina for the resources in the area, such as rubber and oil. Japan's December 7 attack on Pearl Harbor was essentially a response to the embargo. Japan aimed to destroy the Pacific Fleet and cripple American morale, effectively removing the barrier to the Pacific territory and allowing Japan to gain more territory. With the element of surprise and well-designed planes, Pearl Harbor was a decisive victory for Japan. The confidence that they placed in the Zero was reflected in the number they sent to execute the raid. Of their 400 Zero fighters, they only sent 108.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
This attack on Pearl Harbor resounded throughout the country and finally pushed the U.S. to enter the war. The same day of the attack, the U.S. entered the war with their two primary fighters, the P-40 Warhawk and the F-4F Wildcat. Neither of these planes were as nimble as the Zero, despite their top speed. The maneuverability of the Zero combined with the quality training of the pilots were reflected in the numbers, with 471 out of 565 enemy planes downed by the Zero within the first 3 months after the war. The Zero's reputation was also well established as a fast and powerful plane. The initial strategy for Allied forces when dealing with the Zero was boiled down to avoiding dogfights with them, and focusing on invading them and getting the best position to fire. However, in June of 1942, a Zero crash-landed on the Aleutian Islands, remaining intact for it to be found by a patrol on July 10th. The Zero was brought back to the U.S. to be examined and inspected for weaknesses. Soon enough, the U.S. discovered the three fatal flaws of the Zero. Due to the thin armoring of the plane, it only took a few shots to impair a Zero, and a couple test flights showed America that the Zero suffered from the same problems that planes using the early Merlin engines suffered from, such as the Spitfire. The problem was that they used a flight carburetor, which makes maneuvers in Zero-G impossible since it opens the valve which floods and shuts the engine down. In addition to this, the Zero had a sluggish nature at high speeds due to the stiffening of the stick used to control the ailerons on the plane, as it had been too sensitive before, and thus required a way to make it easier to control at higher speeds. After discovering these flaws in the Zero's design, U.S. forces turned the tides of battle, marking the first of a series of tragedies for Japan and triumphs for the Allied forces. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat was introduced in large numbers to the front lines, and the advantages of maneuverability for the Zero were growing smaller and smaller. Japan was also losing their most skilled pilots faster than they could produce them, and as a result, Japan was forced to speed up the training process and focused on quantity over quality.
戦後になって特攻に使われたということが分かってからすごくその時は悲しかったみたいで。
Should someone return, the Japanese ignored the signals sent by them, else they would give away their position to U.S. forces and be overrun by their enemies. Many soldiers lost their friends through this strategy, and it was not only a personal tragedy for Jiro, but the army as well. The ultimate tragedy of the war was the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which killed more than 200,000 civilians, forcing Japan's surrender on September 2, 1945. After the war, the U.S. occupied Japan until April 28, 1952. General Douglas MacArthur led the U.S. occupying forces and put many social, economic, political, and military reforms into effect. Among these reforms were the Constitution of 1947, which limited Japan's military to a small self-defense force. Through these reforms and Western support, Japan eventually recovered to become the second largest economy in the world during the 80s and 90s. The Mitsubishi A6M-0, interwoven throughout the Japanese history of World War II, can reflect the fate of the Japanese Empire. The country triumphed as a whole, and the Zero experienced its own triumphs on the field. Tragedy befell the Zero as tragedy befell the people. As the parable of the farmer illustrates, today's triumph may sow the seeds of tomorrow's tragedy, and vice versa. In achieving its mythic stature, was the Zero a triumph or a tragedy? Maybe both.